Well, happy December. It's December now, I get to say that. I'm excited for Christmas. I don't know if you can tell just by what I'm wearing. Today, we're starting to close in on the end of 2014 or 13, and we're closing in on the end of our Leviticus study. I said last week that we have 3 lessons left, and one of them was going to cover 2 chapters. Today was supposed to be that 2-chapter day. We were going to cover chapters 23 and 25 that both have to do with the Jewish calendar. But after digging a little more in depth into it, I'm making the executive decision that we're not going to cover chapter 25. There's just too much to cover. And so we're going to skip chapter 25. We're not going to cover it at all in the series, which I know is a sorry loss, and it brings untold sorrow to your heart. Yes, I know. Thank you for that. But we're going to skip chapter 25. We're just going to stick with chapter 23, and then we'll go to 26 next week. So we're in chapter 23 of Leviticus this week. The book of Leviticus has been the complete idiot's guide on how to be God's people. And if you weren't aware, what we've really been witnessing over the last 13 weeks is the birth of a culture. God has gathered these people together at Mount Sinai, and he's giving them Leviticus. And with Leviticus, he's establishing a nation, a whole group of people complete with ethics and laws and diet and all kinds of stuff. And when we get to chapter 23, he gives them a calendar. He gives them holidays and festivals to observe, which obviously is a big part of any culture. What kind of calendar do they observe? So I didn't plan on this lesson being right in between the major holidays of Thanksgiving and my birthday this Friday. I didn't plan on that. That's just how it worked out. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and just jump right in and start digging in on this. Chapter 23, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. These are the Lord's appointed festivals, which you are to proclaim as official days for holy assembly. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath day of rest, an official day for holy assembly. It is the Lord's Sabbath day, and it must be observed wherever you live." So, the first day that we encounter is the Sabbath day. Every 7th day, the people of Israel would stop working. 6 days they work and they labor and they toil and they go. But every 7th day, God says, stop working, stop going, stop creating, stop achieving, stop accomplishing. Put the to-do list down and back away slowly. And this really is a reflection of the creation story back in Genesis. The story goes that God begins creation by speaking into the chaotic darkness. And he introduces light for the first time in history. And he spends the first 6 days continuing to create and accomplish and achieve and continuing to separate what is light from what is dark. But on the 7th day, he puts down the cosmic toolbox and he climbs into his heavenly hammock and he rests. He stops going. And this rhythm of stretch and release, this pattern of work, and then stop, quickly gets forgotten by us humans who we just like to work, go all the time. Well, you fast forward a little bit and you find us in Egypt, working as slaves every day, all day, making bricks, all day, 7 days a week, 365 days out of the year. And then God delivers his people out of Egypt. And he gives them back the permission to stop going and just be still. Now, we could go into all kinds of stuff about what happened with the Sabbath. The Sabbath eventually became a day of worship where they would gather in the village, into the village square, and they would study the scriptures and they would pray together, or eventually into the synagogue or into the tabernacle or the temple or wherever you are in history. But they would gather together and they would worship. Now, in Jewish reckoning, the day does not begin at midnight. For us, Tuesday begins at midnight and it goes until midnight. But for the Jews, it begins at sundown on Monday and goes until sundown on Tuesday. And so the Sabbath is this culmination of 6 days that have started at sundown. So you've been working in the fields all day on Monday. And then the sun goes down, the workday is over, you go home, and it's a new day, and you begin your new day by resting. Every day begins with rest. And then every seventh day culminates in this one whole day of rest. Now we could talk about all the rules that came up of what constitutes working on the Sabbath. What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? We could talk about what Jesus says about Sabbath, or how the writer of Hebrews says that there remains a Sabbath rest for God's people. But we'll just leave it with this, that the Sabbath is a reenactment of the story of creation. It's a remembering of how everything began. Now, we'll go into our first holiday in verse 4. In addition to the Sabbath, these are the Lord's appointed festivals, the official days for holy assembly that are to be celebrated at the proper times each year. The Lord's Passover begins at sundown on the 14th day of the first month. On the next day, the 15th day of the month, you must begin celebrating the festival of unleavened bread. This festival to the Lord continues for 7 days, and during that time the bread you eat must be made without yeast. On the first day of the festival, all the people must stop their ordinary work and observe an official day for holy assembly. For 7 days you must present special gifts to the Lord, and on the seventh day the people must again stop all their ordinary work to observe an official day for holy assembly. So the first holiday, we'll get to that, in the Jewish calendar is Passover. Passover commemorates this time when God delivered his people out of Egypt. And that begins on the 14th day. So you start with the month of Aviv, which for them is their January. It falls somewhere between late March and early May. And that begins with the new moon. And on the 14th day after the new moon, you have Passover when sundown happens. The sundown the next day, you begin the festival of unleavened bread for 7 days. So all in all, it's an 8-day event. And it commemorates when God took his people out of Egypt. If you remember the story, there were 10 plagues. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. God sweeps back and forth across the nation of Egypt, and sort of like the bloodiest Santa Claus ever, he enters each home and slaughters the firstborn child in each home. So how are the Israelites supposed to escape God's fury? Well, he tells them to, every household, get for themselves a lamb, slaughter the lamb, roast it, have yourselves a good meal, and take the blood of the lamb and put it on your door. And when I see the blood on your door frame, I'll pass over the house. And so you have the very first Passover. The next day, all the Egyptians are grieving because of the loss of all of their children. The Israelites who are not grieving get up and they leave Egypt all on the same day, and they are delivered through the Red Sea. And then when they get to Leviticus 23, God says, I want you to remember what happened by celebrating Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. Now, this is a rather ornate, rather intricate ceremony. If you've ever looked at a Passover Seder or Passover meal, it's a very, very complicated ceremony. Lots and lots of wine, and each cup of wine is very symbolic of something. There's prayers that get said. There's scripture that gets recited at certain points throughout the meal. We won't go into all that. You could get a whole series of lessons simply out of the Passover meal and the connections with that and the Lord's Supper. But we won't go into all that. We'll just leave it with this. Passover and the festival of unleavened bread are a reminder of when God delivered us out of our slavery in Egypt. Now, we go on to our next festival in verse 9. Then the Lord said to Moses, give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you enter the land I am giving you, and you harvest its first crops, bring the priest a bundle of grain from the first cutting of your grain harvest. On the day after the Sabbath, the first day of the week, the priest will lift it up before the Lord so that he may be accepted on your behalf. On that same day, you must sacrifice a 1-year-old male lamb with no defects as a burnt offering to the Lord. With it, you must present a grain offering consisting of 4 quarts of choice flour moistened with olive oil. It will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. You must also offer 1 quart of wine as a liquid offering, or a quarter of a hin of wine, about a bottle of wine, as a liquid offering. Do not eat any bread or roasted grain or fresh kernels on that day until you bring this offering to your God. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. So your first holiday is Passover, and then you have the 7 days of the festival of unleavened bread where you don't eat anything with yeast because we didn't get to wait for our bread to rise when we left Egypt. And somewhere in that 7-day festival, you have a Sabbath. Somewhere there's a Sabbath. It changes every year. But whatever the day after the Sabbath is, the first day of the week, whatever that Sunday is, you would come and offer the first part of your harvest. You would take the first bundle of grain that you're able to get, the first sheaf of grain. Sheaf? First bundle, and you bring it to the altar. And the priest will wave it in the air, and he'll burn it on the altar. He'll pour a bottle of wine on the altar and burn all that. So it's basically this big meal for God. And it says that you're not supposed to eat until you've done this. You don't get to eat fresh bread or roasted kernels or fresh kernels of wheat. Why? Because the first bite you take means you get the first fruits. And so if God is going to get the first fruits, then you have to wait until he has had his bite before you get to take yours. And this happens during the festival of unleavened bread. Now, today, they don't celebrate this festival anymore. The temple no longer stands in Jerusalem. No temple means no altar. No altar means no sacrifices. No sacrifice means how would you observe this festival to begin with? Well, they just don't anymore. Now, this is the only holiday out of the ones that we look at that doesn't have, that's the next one. This one, if you look back in verse 10, it says, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. When you enter the land I am giving you, you will do this." This is the only one that has some sort of contingency. They don't observe the festival of first fruits while they're wandering in the wilderness. The Israelites are not obliged to do this because they don't have their own land yet. So God's brought his people out of Egypt, and he says, we're going to go somewhere. I've got this land that I've promised to you. And they say, we're in the middle of nowhere. I don't see how you're going to give us any land. And he says, when you get there, you're going to give me your grain. Just a bite, just the first bundle. But you're going to give it to me. When I keep my word, when my promises are fulfilled, I will have the first bundle of grain. And so when they come into the land 40 years later, and they harvest their first harvest of grain, and they bring this bundle of grain to the altar, it's more than just an offering. It's a symbol that God keeps his promises. And so every year as this festival was celebrated on this first day after the Sabbath, during the festival of unleavened bread, every time this was offered, it was a reminder that our God is a God who keeps his promises. Now, we'll go on to the next festival. Verse 15. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you bring the bundle of grain to be lifted up as a special offering, count off 7 full weeks. Keep counting until the day after the 7th Sabbath, 50 days later. Then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. From wherever you live, bring the loaves of bread to be lifted up before the Lord as a special offering. Make these loaves from 4 quarts of choice flour and bake them with yeast. They will be an offering to the Lord from the first of your crops. Along with the bread, present 7 one-year-old male lambs with no defects, 1 young bull, and 2 rams as burnt offerings to the Lord. These burnt offerings, together with the grain offerings and liquid offerings, will be a special gift, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Then you must offer 1 male goat as a sin offering and 2 one-year-old male lambs as a peace offering. The priest will lift up the 2 lambs as a special offering to the Lord, together with the loaves representing the first of your crops. These offerings, which are holy to the Lord, belong to the priests. That same day will be proclaimed an official day for holy assembly, a day on which you do no ordinary work. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest along the edges of your fields, and do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners among you. I am the Lord, your God. This next festival happens 7 weeks after the Feast of First Fruits, which again is on the first day of the week. 7 Sabbaths later is 49 days. And he says, wait until the next day after that 7th Sabbath, 50 days. This festival has different names. It is the festival of harvest, festival of weeks. In Hebrew, it's called Shavuot. In Christianese, we call it Pentecost. And this is the only one where there is no real reason given for observing this holiday. All the other holidays, there's a reason why you observe it. It commemorates something. But this one doesn't seem to have any reason why we're supposed to offer all these animals and grain and bread and everything. So it just isn't told to us why we're supposed to do these things. And Jewish lore has it that this holiday commemorates the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. So you've had Passover, where God has passed over his people and delivered them through the Red Sea. You have the Festival of First Fruits, where he says, we're going somewhere. And then you have the Feast of First Fruits, where you commemorate the giving of the law on the mountain. If you were to go and want to observe this festival today, a lot of it would be lost, because a lot of it has to do with animal sacrifices and bread sacrifices. And again, no temple, no altar, no sacrifices today. And so Jews today, when they observe Shavuot, they spend the whole night leading up to it in Bible study, and they pray into the wee hours of the morning. And they have one meal on this day where they eat a meal entirely of dairy to remind them that God brought them to the land of milk and honey. And then when they gather in the synagogues, they read the book of Ruth, which no one really knows why they do that. There's different theories and nobody really agrees. It's kind of like, where did that come from? Ruth. But they read Ruth. This is how they celebrate Shavuot, the giving of the law. And so, as people celebrate this, they remember their time in the wilderness. Now notice what happens in the next holiday, which is Yom Kippur. We'll begin in verse 23. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. On the first day of the appointed month in early autumn, which is the 7th month, okay, so we're halfway through the year, on the first day of the second half of the year, you are to observe a day of complete rest. It will be an official day for a holy assembly, a day commemorated with loud blasts of a trumpet. You must do no ordinary work on that day. Instead, you are to present special gifts to the Lord." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Be careful to celebrate the Day of Atonement on the 10th day of that same month, 9 days after the Festival of Trumpets. You must observe it as an official day for holy assembly, a day to deny yourselves and present special gifts to the Lord. Do no work during that entire day, because it is the Day of Atonement, when offerings of purification are made for you, making you right with the Lord your God. All who do not deny themselves that day will be cut off from God's people, and I will destroy anyone among you who does any work on that day. You must not do any work at all. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. This will be a Sabbath day of complete rest for you, and on that day you must deny yourselves. This day of rest will begin at sundown on the 9th day of the month and extend until sundown on the 10th day." So this next festival, which comes shortly after the Feast of Weeks, is the Festival of Trumpets, or the Feast of Trumpets, and Yom Kippur. One is on the first day of the 7th month, one is on the 10th day. The Feast of Trumpets today is called Rosh Hashanah. Have you ever heard of Rosh Hashanah? In Hebrew, it means first, Rosh, first, Hashanah, of the year. This is the Jewish New Year, and it happens right in the middle of the year. And it's followed 5 days after with the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where the slate is wiped clean for everybody. All sin is taken care of. Now, we won't go a whole lot into Yom Kippur. That was chapter 16. We talked about that weeks ago. If you're really interested in Yom Kippur, go back, read the chapter, go back on the website, listen to the lesson. We won't go there right now. But you have Passover, where we're delivered out of our physical bondage. And you have the Feast of First Fruits, which is about the promise of we're going somewhere. And then you have the Feast of Weeks, which is about the giving of the law on the mountain, which delivers us out of spiritual slavery to idolatry and immorality. Thank you, God, for giving us the law. And then after that, what's the next holiday? It's a new year. It's a new, fresh beginning. It's a fresh start for everybody. We've been delivered out of our physical and our spiritual slavery, and now we have a fresh beginning. Now there's one last festival in verse 33. The Lord said to Moses, "Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. Begin celebrating the festival of shelters on the 15th day of the appointed month, 5 days after the Day of Atonement. This festival to the Lord will last for 7 days. On the first day of the festival, you must proclaim an official day for holy assembly when you do no ordinary work. For 7 days, you must present special gifts to the Lord. The 8th day is another holy day on which you present your special gifts to the Lord. This will be a solemn occasion, and no ordinary work may be done that day." And then we'll skip down to verse 41. "You must observe this festival to the Lord for 7 days every year. This is a permanent law for you, and it must be observed in the appointed month from generation to generation. For 7 days, you must live outside in little shelters. All native-born Israelites must live in shelters. This will remind each new generation of Israelites that I made their ancestors live in shelters when I rescued them from the land of Egypt. I am the Lord, your God." This festival gets different names depending on what translation you're reading. It's the Festival of Shelters, the Festival of Tabernacles, the Festival of Booths. In Hebrew, it's just called Sukkot, which is a lot easier because there's only one, Sukkot. If you were to go to Israel today and you were to witness, if you were to be there during the Festival of Sukkot, and you were to walk down the streets of Jerusalem, you would see something a bit like this. Each of these wooden boxes, standing about 12 feet by 12 feet or so, is a sukkah, a shelter, a tabernacle, a booth. And each family will build a sukkah, and they will go out and have all of their meals in this canopy for 7 days. And the hardcore purists will even sleep out there and not ever go into their house for 7 days, because it reminds them that when we were delivered out of Egypt, we lived in shelters. It's a reminder of who we are, where we come from, our humble beginnings. This is our roots. This is what it looked like when we first were a nation born out of Egypt. Now just imagine that you're a Jewish child in the first century, about 1400 years after the book of Leviticus is received. You're growing up in Israel. You don't have the major holidays of Christmas and Thanksgiving and Memorial Day and Parker's birthday and St. Patrick's Day and Easter and the big ones. You don't have those. You have Sukkot, Shavuot, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah. These are your holidays. This is your calendar. This is how you understand time. You're brought up understanding that you begin the year with Passover, and then a remembrance of God's promises, and then this remembrance of when we received the law, and then this remembrance of wandering through the of the new year, and then the wandering through the wilderness. Every year, this gets drilled into you. And it's a way for your parents to pass on their heritage to you, because you begin to learn the rhythm of your people. And the Jewish calendar tells a story. It tells the story of how Israel came out of Egypt and where we come from and who we are. It begins with us coming out of Egypt, and then we're going somewhere, and then the law, and then there's a new beginning. We're a new people and wandering in the wilderness. That's where we come from. This is our beginning, and the festivals highlight that in order. So imagine, as a young child growing up in the first century in Israel, you begin to see yourself, after doing this year after year, decade after decade, century after century, you begin to see yourself as an actor in an ongoing drama. You begin to see Abraham and Moses as contemporaries, not ancient predecessors. You begin to say things like, when God delivered us through the Red Sea. You see, it's not God delivered them through the Red Sea, it's He delivered us. When He gave the law, not to them, when He gave the law to me, it was my family wandering through the wilderness. It was my family that was atoned for. It was my family that received the promises. It was me. I was there. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, I was there. You begin to see history as your own history as you reenact the story over and over and over. In the Jewish calendar, the Jewish worldview comes alive. Who are we? We are Israel. We are God's chosen people. Where are we? Well, we're living in His promised land. This is where the story was all headed, here in the land. But there's a problem. We get kicked out of the land, and we live in exile. And now here we are in Babylon. Here we are in Assyria. And what are we supposed to do now? There's a problem. The promise was fulfilled, and yet we're not in our own land. Who are we without the land? Even when we come back, the Greeks conquer us and the Romans conquer us, and we're living. You're a child in the first century. You have Romans that walk up and down the streets reminding you that you're not your own people. There's a problem here. We don't have our own rulers. We don't have our own laws. This world is less than ideal. And yet you remember year after year we were delivered, and there's a promise. And He freed us, and we have a new beginning. This is where we come from. Their hope for their glorious future is rooted not in some imagination. It's rooted in their history. And if Leviticus 23 teaches us nothing else, it's that. Hope comes from a strong memory, not a strong imagination. Hope comes from a strong memory, not a strong imagination. If you were to walk up and down the streets and ask people, hey, what's hope? I don't know why you have a microphone, but what's hope? Define hope. They would say, I hope you get that microphone out of my face. Hope, they would probably equate with something akin to wishful thinking. I hope that my package comes in the mail today. I hope we make it back before nightfall. I hope that I get that thing for Christmas. I hope. And yet, when the biblical writers use this word hope, it means something entirely different. For them, hope is a confident expectation of a future reality. Hope is where you plant your flag. Hope is where you push all your chips in. It's not wishful thinking. It's confident expectation. Wishful thinking is based on imagination. Wishful thinking is based on desire. It's not based on experience. But hope is based on experience. Hope is based on evidence. Hope is based on we've been here before. We've done this before. God is the God that He's always been. God is a God who delivers. God is a God who redeems. God is a God of fresh beginnings. And He's always been that way, and He will be in the future. So what's the connection between memory and hope? Well, let me give you a couple of ideas. First of all, a strong memory knows that the present condition is not the only option. A strong memory looks around its environment and says, this isn't how it has to be. It doesn't have to be this way. Things change. I remember 200, 300, 400 years ago, this isn't how it was, and this isn't how it's always going to be. How many of you have ever caught yourself thinking, I remember when we didn't have all these phones with the internets and the Wi-Fis and the emails, and things were so much simpler then. How many of you have ever thought something like that? Yeah, we had Grandma down over Thanksgiving, and that evening we were each on our different devices, checking Facebook, checking email, and Grandma said something like, Thanksgiving is a day when everybody gets together and they eat and they look at their phones. I remember a day when that wasn't like this. When you do that, when you say, I remember the good old days when it wasn't like this, what are you doing? You're evaluating the present condition and you're saying this isn't the only option. There's another way. There's hope for something better than what we have right now. Second thing, a strong memory informs the present of what is possible. A strong memory says, my God has done this before, my God can do this again. My God has done this, He has accomplished this, He has performed this, He has promised this, and He will do it again. It is possible. It's been done before. Sometimes we get feeling a bit trapped where we are, feeling a bit hopeless. And then memory comes along and says, God can do things. What would it do for you if you were to take a piece of notebook paper and tack it on your fridge or stick it in your Bible, and every time God answers a prayer, you just write it down? If you just wrote down one answered prayer every week, at the end of a year, you'd have a list of 50 things that God has done in my life. I remember. You remember when Macy was sick and we prayed for her and God healed her? You remember when we were struggling to make ends meet and then God? You remember when God did this? If you had a strong memory of the things that God has done, would it change your outlook on the present? What's possible for you? And then one more thought. A strong memory confirms our sense of purpose. One of my all-time favorite TV shows, my all-time favorite TV show was Lost on ABC. Stopped airing a few years ago. I was really sad. I don't know if I can do that. But it stopped airing a few years ago. Got 6 seasons out of it. And it was one of the most widely followed shows on ABC of all time. I think if you go back on the website, you can still watch all the episodes on the ABC website. But the show is about a group of people, about 40 people, that survive a plane crash on this island. And it begins with them sort of trying to figure out how are we going to survive on this island, and then how are we going to get home because rescue's not coming. It's sort of what happens if you put Gilligan's Island and Grey's Anatomy and The Twilight Zone in a blender and turn it into a TV show. You get lost. And what made the show really compelling was you begin to get the sense that these 40-odd people are here for a reason. That each one of them has some kind of purpose in coming to the island. It is not by chance that each of these people has arrived here. And they do that by giving you glimpses into their past. As you learn more and more about this character and what they've been going through and what they're fighting and what they're struggling with, and then you see they come to the island, you begin to realize the island fixes everything for them. The island provides some kind of purpose for them. It resolves conflict for them. As you look into their memory, into their past, you begin to get a sense of direction. Darrell Tippins, in his superb book, Pilgrim Heart, says this: "The gift of memory helps in many ways. It gives us our deep sense of chosenness. It confirms our mission to be a blessing in the lives of all whom we meet, and it illuminates our purposes in the darkest times." When you are a Jew living in Israel in the first century and you celebrate Passover, it reminds you that God brought us out of Egypt for a reason. We have a purpose. And you know what? God's not done with me yet. And when you flip through your Bible and you look at this piece of paper with 50-odd things that God has done in my life, you begin to get the impression that, you know what? God's not done with me yet. There's a purpose. There's a direction to my life. This is going somewhere. So let me just close by offering a couple of questions. First of all, what has God done in your life biblically? What promises has He made in Scripture that He has fulfilled? What promises are you yet anticipating? Resurrection, a new body, light at the end of the tunnel, redemption, purpose. What things has He done in your own life personally? What things has He done that you could write down, this week God did this? What has He done for you? And what can you do to remember these things? For the Jews, it was a calendar. But what rituals could you install in your life? Where could you put a piece of paper with a list of His kept promises? What could you do to remind yourself of what God has done? Because hope doesn't come from a strong imagination. It comes from a strong memory. One of my all-time favorite bands, the David Crowder Band, has a song called Come and Listen. And I'll just end with the lyrics to this song. Come and listen. Come to the water's edge, all you who know and fear the Lord. Come and listen. Come to the water's edge, all you who are thirsty. Come. Let me tell you what he has done for me. Let me tell you what he has done for me. He has done for you. He has done for us. Come and listen. Come and listen to what he has done. Come and listen. Come and listen to what he has done. Praise our God, for he is good. 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 He has done for me. He has done for you. He's done for us. Come and listen. Come and listen to what he's done. Come and listen. Come and listen to what he's done. May you remember what he has done for you. May you praise him, for he is good. And may you be holy as he is holy.